Hi everyone. In this clip, we're going to be going through how we can create some screenshots for ourselves that we can use inside of Photoshop. Now, what we want to do here is basically start to get our final version here that we can take and start painting over and create sort of our final concept package. Now, I do want to point out that there were some changes in between our clips. Those were just some details that I wanted to add. And again, the revision process with ZBrush can be very iterative. So instead of the handles that were existing here, I kind of just took them out and reused the bottom section here. I also added in a couple of bolts. Those are just appending a sphere and just kind of flattening it out and duplicating it several times. Very simple process, but just kind of refining things here and there so that I get a bit of a more utility looking object as opposed to something that was a little bit too flowery, I felt like, with the extra details here that were going up instead of the piece that I've got now. So that's all it is. So now we've got this sort of finished piece, but how do we start to take it out? Now, literally, I could just do a print screen and take this into Photoshop, but for the moment, I'm going to use a different process right now, which is to do a BPR render. So what that's going to do is if we just get a nice angle here, we can press P on our keyboard, which will give us a perspective view. Now, if I wanted to get access to that in here, I can start to go to my render settings to start to adjust some of those things, as well as my draw area for the perspective. So if I increase this to something much higher, you'll see that my perspective angle goes to a much higher viewpoint. But instead, I'll just go to the defaults. They're just fine. I don't need to necessarily create a highly perspective kind of image here. I'm going to find an angle that I like that gives me a pretty good indication of what the shape of my model is. And I'm going to go to this little BPR button here and just press BPR. And what it'll do is do a basic render here. Now, there's other options that I can get from my render tab, which again I got from over here. And just to show, I dragged it over into this palette from that point. Now in this piece, I can start to adjust. So the render properties that I get here can have a number of different options in them. I could have smooth normals, which we really don't need for the most part. I could have shadows or ambient occlusion turned on as well. So when I press BPR, it's going to take a little bit longer, but a slight ambient occlusion will be included in here. I could have wax previews and subsurface scattering all put into this, but for the most part, we don't really need a lot of those things. They can be fun to play with, and they're worth fiddling with, but the fact of the matter is I don't really need them too much for this process. If I did, the only one that I really like to work with is the AO process. Changing its angle and those kinds of things can end up producing a much better result from your BPR, where you can get little dark shadows into some of our crevices. But the problem is, it takes quite a bit to start to fiddle with it and to get it just right. So in some cases, it may not be worth the work that it takes to get. As we start to go through these options, it's really hard to see these tiny little differences in here. So in general, I just kind of leave AO out and I don't worry about it too much. But if you want to spend time with it, it can be worth it. Now in this case, what we're seeing here is just basically a cleaned up version of our render. But the better part about this is that I can get my render passes. So in here, for example, it's going to show all the different versions of our mesh, as well as a depth draw, which can be useful for certain effects, and a mask for this. Now what I do want to do is just click this BPR, and if I click shaded, I'm going to be able to export a file directly to my processes folder to get different kinds of renders done for me. So in here, in my render folder, I can start to render out different file names. So for example, I could name this base gray. So I save that out, and basically it's just going to save a little simple image for me, and I'll be able to use this inside Photoshop. And we could stop. At this point, I could take all this information into Photoshop and start painting over top of it. But it's also useful to grab some different materials. So for example, I could grab different kinds of materials here, such as this shiny material, and see how its material might work. So this I could use for various other types of metals. Maybe see if this one works. I can do a BPR render to see if that gives a more interesting kind of metal look to this. And I could try just saying, okay, well, let's just also save that out. So this is base metal 1. Because I'm probably going to do several of these. I could see if the chrome would work well, do a BPR render. That doesn't quite work for me in this case. Now, these materials up top may render differently than the materials below. Sometimes hair can look a lot like metal, And so again, we could just kind of bake this out so that we can composite things later differently. So base metal 2, let's maybe grab, what's the Z metal? That doesn't look a lot like metal compared to those other ones. And again, you can just start to grab all these various different pieces and start seeing how they might look as a render. This one's a bit softer in terms of its material. But let's go back to our basic material, and let's do something where we adjust some of our lights. Let's bring our light axis here. And what we can start to do is start to adjust as well. So for example, over here, I may want a sort of rim light that I could get in this case. I may want to increase the intensity of that. If I double click on this, I also get to set that light to appear behind my mesh, which is kind of what I want in this case. So there we go. That's a nice rim light that I can get here. Do a BPR pass on that. That creates something that'll be very useful for me as well. So again, I'll just go back to my BPR, click shaded, and let's just call this rim light. So that's great. And again, I can just adjust my lighting for other various lighting opportunities that I may want. So maybe something from high up with a bit lower intensity. BPR render that. So now I got some nice shadows that are going to appear here. Let's see if that maybe appears a little bit better from right above. Again, do that BPR render pass. It's pretty interesting, but a little bit too stark. So let's just bring this out to the front. Just double click. Put it up right towards the top. Maybe do a little bit more intensity. BPR. And this angle could work quite nicely. It'll highlight that edge. Of course, I could paint all of this in myself. I don't have to do this through here. But it can be useful to kind of paint this in through different render passes. And at this point, I'll just save that out. And we can just go top light. So now, all of these pieces can go into Photoshop and be composited together. So that's it for this module. In summary, what we've learned from this module is how to hard surface model inside of ZBrush, how we can do some advanced transpose tool techniques, how we can use Z-Remesher for keeping clean, simple shapes, and how we can refine and add detail to our design inside of ZBrush. By having all these understandings, we're able to better create a really detailed concept inside of ZBrush in this module.